Racist policemen decide to humiliate a man by stopping him on a deserted highway. They overstep their bounds by shoving a gun in his mouth, confident of their impunity. But an unexpected revelation awaits them, which will turn their lives upside down. What will happen next? Subscribe to find out how events unfold, and share in the comments where you're watching this video from. The highway stretched endlessly into the night, illuminated only by the pale glow of headlights and the faint shimmer of the stars above. The world outside the car seemed eerily quiet, an expanse of shadowy trees on either side of the road, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There wasn't a single soul in sight. Not a single sign of life other than the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets that filtered through the windows. James Carter adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead with a calm yet calculated focus. It had been a long day, but this drive was necessary, even vital. Alone in his black SUV, dressed in a tailored suit that had started to feel a bit too formal for the setting, he looked more like a businessman lost in the countryside than what he truly was, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He reached over to the passenger seat, picking up a small thermos of coffee he had prepared earlier. The warmth of the drink provided a brief comfort against the growing chill in the air, but his mind remained restless. This wasn't just another late-night drive or a meeting or briefing. This was personal. He'd made it personal. The complaints about this stretch of highway, about the town it led to, had come across his desk too many times to ignore. Reports of brutality, abuse, and worse, all dismissed as baseless by the local authorities. But James knew better. He always knew better. The road narrowed as he approached a dense forest, the trees leaning in closer to the edges of the pavement, as if trying to suffocate the light. His grip on the wheel tightened. There was something oppressive about this area, an invisible weight that seemed to press down on everything and everyone. It wasn't just the road, it was the legacy of the place. A town that had clung to outdated notions of power and control for far too long. The stories he'd read, the evidence he'd seen, all pointed to one conclusion. Something was deeply wrong here. As his SUV continued its steady pace, James's thoughts drifted back to the conversation that had sparked this journey. It had been a quiet afternoon in his Washington office, when an anonymous tip had come in, a detailed report of two specific officers known for targeting minorities, their actions shielded by a complicit system. The accusations were severe: harassment, false arrests, and in some cases, physical violence. The tipper had included dates, names, and locations, all meticulously documented. James had read it twice, then a third time. He had felt a familiar anger bubbling beneath his usually composed exterior. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such accusations in his career, but something about this one had struck a nerve. The precision of the details, the brazenness of the alleged perpetrators, it was a challenge to his own beliefs about justice and fairness. He had made his decision that same day: no agents, no press, no formal inquiries. He would go himself, blending in as an ordinary man on an ordinary trip to see just how deep this rot went. He didn't trust reports anymore. He needed to see it firsthand. As the forest gave way to another stretch of open road, James glanced at the dashboard. It was nearing midnight, the time when the world seemed most vulnerable and the shadows of humanity often revealed themselves. He felt the weight of the concealed recording device in his pocket, a small but powerful tool. Every interaction tonight would be captured, every word, every threat, every act of intimidation. He slowed the car slightly as he approached a bend in the road. There, In the distance, the glow of red and blue lights flashed briefly before disappearing. James felt his pulse quicken. A police cruiser had just passed him, going in the opposite direction, its lights momentarily piercing the darkness. His instincts sharpened. Would they stop? Would they notice him? Or were they already hunting for their next target? He drove on, forcing himself to maintain a steady speed. His mind began replaying every preparation he had made for this encounter, every contingency plan. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The rear-view mirror caught the sudden reappearance of those red and blue lights. The police cruiser had turned around. It was following him now. James's heart thudded in his chest, but outwardly he remained calm. He signaled right and began to pull over to the side of the road, his tires crunching against loose gravel as he came to a stop. The cruiser stopped behind him, its lights still flashing. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and reached for the registration papers in his glove compartment. His hands moved methodically, his mind already preparing for what was about to come. Two figures emerged from the cruiser, their silhouettes tall and imposing against the backdrop of flashing lights. One of them, stocky and broad-shouldered, adjusted his belt as he walked, his movements deliberate and heavy. The other, slightly shorter and leaner, hesitated for a moment before following. James watched them approach in his side mirror, noting every detail. The way the first man's hand rested on his holster, the casual arrogance in his stride, the subtle nervous energy in the second man's step. The first officer reached James's window and tapped on it with a knuckle. James rolled it down, keeping his expression neutral. "Evening," the officer drawled, his voice low and rough. "You lost?" James shook his head. "No, officer, just checking my map for the best route into town." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What brings you out here so late?" James handed over his registration and license, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Just passing through, heading to a hotel." The second officer stepped closer, peering into the car. "Nice ride," he muttered. "What kind of business yen?" James kept his tone even. "Consulting." The first officer smirked, glancing at his partner. Consulting, huh? Well, let's see if your papers check out." James watched as the officer walked back to the cruiser with his documents. The second officer lingered by the window, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. "You seem awfully calm," he remarked, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. "Most folks get a little jittery when we stop them." James met his gaze evenly. "Should I be jittery?" The officer hesitated, his mouth tightening into a thin line. Before he could respond, his partner returned, holding the documents loosely in one hand. "Everything checks out," he said, though there was a note of irritation in his voice. "But you're still out awful late for someone just passing through. Mind if we take a look inside the car?" James's pulse quickened, but he gave a slight nod. "Go ahead." He stepped out of the car, his every movement deliberate, careful not to give them any excuse to escalate. As he stood by the side of the road, the two officers began their search, their actions more invasive than necessary. They rifled through the glove compartment, pulled open the center console, and even checked under the seats. James stood in the cold night air, watching silently, his calm demeanor hiding the storm brewing inside him. The first officer, whose name tag read Rives, finally straightened up, a smirk on his face. "Looks like you're clean," he said, but his tone was anything but friendly, for now. James knew this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The night felt heavier now, as if the darkness itself had thickened around James. The gravel under his feet shifted as he stood by the roadside. watching the two officers move with deliberate slowness, dragging out their search of his car. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruiser cast distorted, fleeting shadows across the scene, making everything seem more surreal. James adjusted his stance, his face a mask of calm neutrality. Inside, his thoughts churned, cataloging every detail. The smugness in Officer Rives' expression, the way his partner, Hendricks, according to his badge, kept glancing toward him as if gauging his reaction. He noted how Rives took his time rifling through the glove compartment again, even though he'd already searched it twice, while Hendricks busied himself with peering under the seats with exaggerated thoroughness. It wasn't just a search. It was a performance, an act designed to provoke and humiliate. James recognized it immediately. He had seen it too many times in the countless reports that crossed his desk. This was about power, about reminding someone who they thought was beneath them that they controlled the moment. "Traveling light, huh?" Rives remarked as he held up a leather folder containing neatly organized papers. "No luggage?" James kept his voice measured. "Just a short trip. Everything I need is in the car." Rives flipped through the folder slowly, his smirk widening. "Consulting, right? That must pay well." He glanced back at Hendricks. "What do you think, John? Think he's got more in this car than he's letting on?" Hendricks hesitated, his hand still resting on the edge of the passenger seat. "Looks clean to me," he said, his voice lacking conviction. Rives snapped the folder shut and tossed it back onto the driver's seat with deliberate carelessness. "Looks clean," he echoed mockingly. "You hear that? You got John's seal of approval. Must mean you're a model citizen." James didn't take the bait. He knew they wanted him to react, to give them a reason to escalate. Instead, he straightened slightly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Am I free to go, officers?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Rives' smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculated stare. "Not so fast. We're not done here yet." James felt the tension in the air thicken, a palpable shift in the energy between them. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Rives, who ignored him and took a step closer to James. "You seem awful calm," Rives said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Most folks we stop this late, they're nervous, fidgety, but not you. Why's that?" James met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to hide." Rives chuckled, a sharp, humorless sound. "Right? You know, people who think they've got nothing to hide usually just don't know what we're looking for." He took another step forward, invading James's personal space. The two men were almost the same height, but Rives carried himself with an air of unearned superiority, a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. "Let's try something," Rives said, his tone turning darker. "Kneel." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Hendricks looked up sharply, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no sound came out. James didn't move, his expression unchanged, though inside he felt a flicker of rage ignite. "Is that necessary?" he asked evenly. Rives' smirk returned, more menacing now. "Oh, it's very necessary. Gotta make sure you're not hiding anything. Go on, kneel." James held his ground, his mind racing through his options. He could refuse outright, but he knew what that would lead to. He could comply, but that would only embolden them. He thought of the tiny recording device hidden in his pocket, its presence a silent reassurance. Whatever happened, it would all be captured. He took a slow breath, then lowered himself to his knees on the gravel. The sharp edges bit into his skin through the fabric of his trousers, But he didn't flinch. His eyes never left Rivers. "See? That wasn't so hard," Rives said, circling him like a predator. "Now, hands behind your head." James complied, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady. He could feel the weight of Hendrix's stare, the younger officer frozen in place, his unease radiating like heat. "You know what I think?" Rives continued, stopping in front of James. "I think you're a little too comfortable out here, like maybe you're hiding something. Or maybe you think you're smarter than us." James said nothing, his silence a calculated choice. He wouldn't give Reeves the satisfaction of a reaction. "John, grab the flashlight," Rives ordered without looking back. "Let's check his mouth." Hendrik hesitated, his voice wavering when he finally spoke. "What? Why?" "Because I said so," Rives snapped, his tone brooking no argument. Hendrix handed over the flashlight reluctantly. Ribs leaned closer to James, his smirk widening. "Open wide," he said, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "Let's see if you're hiding anything in there." James didn't move. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to remain calm. Rives's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Fine," he said, straightening and reaching for his holster. "Let's try this another way." The gun came out smoothly, the barrel gleaming under the harsh glare of the flashlight. Hendrix took an involuntary step back, his face pale. "Rives," he began, but the senior officer cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Shut up, John," Rives snapped. He turned back to James, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Open your mouth." For a long moment, neither man moved. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, the world around them shrinking to just this moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, James opened his mouth. He could feel the cold metal of the barrel as Rivs pressed it against his lips, then forced it inside. "Good," Reeves said, his voice laced with mock approval. "See? You can follow orders." The taste of steel filled James's mouth, bitter and metallic. His jaw ached, but he didn't flinch, didn't react. He kept his eyes locked on Rives, his silence a defiance of its own. After what felt like an eternity, Rives pulled the gun back with a sharp, dismissive motion. He stood over James, his smirk returning. "Guess you're not hiding anything," he said, holstering the weapon. "Get up." James rose slowly, his movements controlled, his expression unreadable. He could feel the rawness in his knees, the sting of humiliation. But he buried it deep. This wasn't over. Not yet. Rives turned to Hendrix, who looked as if he might be sick. "Let's wrap this up," Rives said. "I think our friend here's had enough fun for one night." Hendrix nodded wordlessly, retreating to the cruiser. Rives lingered for a moment longer, his smirk twisting into something uglier. "You're free to go," he said, his tone mocking. "But remember, we'll be watching." James said nothing as he climbed back into his SUV. He started the engine, the familiar hum steadying him. As he pulled back onto the highway, he felt the weight of the recording device in his pocket, its presence a silent promise. This wasn't over. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, but James Carter wasn't focused on the horizon anymore. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the scene that had just unfolded in his mind. The cold metal of the gun barrel against his lips, the mocking smirk on Rives's face, and the silent complicity of Hendrix. All of it lingered like a bitter aftertaste. He forced himself to take a deep breath. Losing focus now wasn't an option. His mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Every word, every movement, every threat, he had captured it all. The small recording device tucked away in his pocket was his safeguard, his weapon. He reminded himself that enduring humiliation tonight would pave the way for justice tomorrow. The flashing lights of the police cruiser disappeared in his rearview mirror as James pressed the accelerator, eager to leave the suffocating presence of his tormentors behind. But the adrenaline coursing through his veins made it impossible to relax. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, shame, determination. He had faced threats before, even stared down the barrel of a gun in his earlier years as a field agent. But this was different. This wasn't just about him, it was about a system that allowed men like Reeves to operate with impunity. As he drove, the silence inside the car became oppressive. The hum of the engine and the faint chirping of crickets outside seemed almost mocking. James glanced at the passenger seat, where his briefcase and phone sat untouched. He was tempted to call his assistant to report what had happened and begin taking immediate action. But he knew better. Rushing now would jeopardize everything. He needed to be meticulous, to gather every possible piece of evidence before making his move. The memory of Rive's smirk flashed through his mind again, igniting a fresh wave of anger. He clenched his jaw, gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The man had treated him like he was nothing, like his humanity was irrelevant. And Hendricks, he was just as guilty. His silence, his hesitation to act, had made him complicit. James couldn't help but wonder if there had been a moment, even a fleeting one, where Hendricks had considered standing up to his partner. If there had been, it hadn't lasted long. James shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He didn't have time to dissect the moral failures of those two men, not now. His priority was to ensure they could never do this to anyone else again. The road began to wind through a denser patch of forest, the trees closing in on either side like silent sentinels. James adjusted his rearview mirror out of habit, his eyes scanning for any sign of headlights. The last thing he needed was for Ribbs and Hendricks to change their minds and come after him again. But the road behind him was empty, a stretch of uninterrupted darkness. He slowed the car slightly, his mind returning to the interaction. The way Ribbs had taken pleasure in asserting his dominance. The way he had used his weapon not out of fear or necessity but as a tool of humiliation. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was criminal. James had dealt with power-hungry individuals before, but there was something particularly sinister about Ribbs. He didn't just abuse his authority, he reveled in it. And yet James couldn't ignore the complexity of the situation. Hendricks was an enigma. The younger officer's discomfort had been evident, his reluctance to participate clear. But in the end, he hadn't stopped it. That made him just as dangerous. A man who wouldn't act on his conscience was no better than one who acted with malice. The car's headlights caught the outline of a small roadside diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. James hesitated for a moment before deciding to pull over. He needed a moment to gather his thoughts, to plan his next steps. The confrontation with the officers had left him drained, and the idea of a hot cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet reflection was too tempting to resist. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a beat-up pickup truck and a dusty sedan. James parked near the entrance and stepped out, stretching his legs and adjusting his tie. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension that had filled the last hour. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, absently wiping down the surface, while an older man in a trucker hat nursed a cup of coffee in one of the corner booths. James chose a seat near the window where he could keep an eye on the parking lot and waited for the waitress to approach. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice tired but polite. "Just coffee, please," James replied, offering a small smile. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. James leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. The small talk, the mundane environment, it felt like a strange juxtaposition to the chaos he had just endured. He could almost pretend that this was a normal night, that he wasn't carrying the weight of a system's failures on his shoulders. But the illusion didn't last long. His mind kept returning to the recording device in his pocket, to the evidence it held. He had everything he needed to expose Rives and Hendricks, but he knew this was just the beginning. The rot ran deeper than two officers on a power trip. It was systemic, embedded in the culture of this town and others like it. Taking down Rives and Hendricks was a start, but it wouldn't be enough. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting the mug down in front of him. "Anything else?" she asked. James shook his head. "No, thank you." As she walked away, James took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. He needed to think clearly, to map out his next steps. The confrontation had rattled him more than he cared to admit, but it had also reinforced his resolve. He had come here to uncover the truth, and now he had it. The question was, what to do next? He pulled out his phone and opened a secure app, scrolling through his notes and the tip that had brought him here. The anonymous source had been thorough, providing dates, times, and descriptions of incidents involving Rives and Hendricks. James had initially been skeptical, but now he knew it was all true. The question was how many more victims there had been, how many others had suffered in silence. As he sipped his coffee, James made a silent promise to himself. He would see this through no matter the cost. He had endured humiliation tonight, but it would not be in vain. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of holding Rives and Hendricks accountable. And if that meant dismantling the system that protected them, so be it. The thought gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. He had spent his career fighting for justice, often against overwhelming odds. This would be no different. James sat in his car, the weight of the night pressing down on him as he stared at the road ahead. The cup of coffee he'd finished at the diner had given him a temporary jolt of energy, but the emotional toll of the encounter with officers Rives and Hendricks lingered. He could still feel the cold metal of the gun barrel, the gravel biting into his knees, and the mocking tone of Rives's voice. The memory was raw, visceral, and infuriating. Oh, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The faint glow of his dashboard clock read just past 2 in the morning, and the world around him seemed eerily quiet. He needed to keep moving, but his mind refused to let go of the night's events. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recording device, its weight both comforting and sobering. Every word, every threat, every humiliation, they were all there waiting to be played back. But tonight wasn't just about what had happened on that stretch of road. It was about what had brought him here in the first place. As the engine hummed softly and the trees along the highway blurred into indistinct shadows, James let his mind drift back to the moments that had defined him, the moments that had prepared him for this fight. It started with his father. James was 10 years old, sitting at the worn wooden kitchen table in their small home in rural Georgia. The room was modest, the walls lined with photographs of family members and framed certificates of achievements his parents had earned despite countless obstacles. His father, Thomas Carter, was a towering figure both physically and morally, a man whose presence commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. "Boy," his father had said that evening, his deep voice filled with a calm authority, "you're going to face a lot in this life. People are going to look at you and think they know you, think they can judge you. But you got to hold your head high. You hear me?" James nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "Yes, sir." Thomas leaned forward, resting his large calloused hands on the table. "The world ain't fair, son. But fairness ain't what we fight for. We fight for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Those words had stayed with James, their meaning becoming clearer with every challenge he faced. As a young black man in the Deep South, he had learned early on that fairness was a luxury, not a guarantee. He had seen his father stand tall in the face of discrimination, had watched him fight for justice in their community with a dignity that left a lasting impression. But the memory that burned brightest was from a summer afternoon when James was 15. His father had been pulled over by the police while driving James and his younger sister home from a school event. James could still see the flashing lights, the sneering officer who barked orders, and the way his father had calmly complied despite the blatant disrespect. James had clenched his fists, his teenage anger bubbling over. "Why are you letting him talk to you like that?" he had whispered fiercely. Tomac had glanced at him, his expression steady. "Because pride don't win battles, son. Patience does. And sometimes the best way to fight is to let them think they've won." That day had been a turning point for James. He had seen firsthand the balance his father maintained, refusing to be broken by injustice, but choosing his moments to push back. It was a lesson he carried into his adult life, shaping the way he approached every challenge. Back in the present, James exhaled slowly, his father's words echoing in his mind. Patience doesn't mean inaction. It means strategy, and tonight, James had played his role perfectly, enduring Rivers and Hendricks' abuse while silently gathering the evidence he needed to take them down. But patience didn't erase the sting of humiliation. The image of Rives shoving the gun into his mouth flashed through James's mind again, and his chest tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd been forced to endure such degradation, but it was the first time in years that he had felt this level of rage. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe deeply, to stay focused. He couldn't let his emotions control him, not now. The road ahead was empty, the occasional streetlight casting fleeting pools of light across his windshield. As the highway stretched on, James's thoughts shifted to the broader implications of his mission. The anonymous tip he had received hadn't just been about Rives and Hendricks. It had been about a pattern of abuse in this town, a deeply rooted culture of racism and corruption that allowed men like them to thrive. James had spent hours poring over the details before deciding to come here. The tip had included names, dates, and witness accounts, all painting a damning picture of a police force operating with impunity. Rives and Hendricks were just the tip of the iceberg, and tonight had confirmed what James had already suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a system. He pulled off the highway at a small rest stop, parking under a dimly lit canopy. The silence here was even more profound, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. James leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew he needed rest, but his mind refused to quiet. He thought about the other victims, people whose names he didn't yet know but whose stories were all too familiar. A black teenager arrested for resisting arrest after asking why he'd been stopped. A Hispanic man beaten during a routine traffic stop while his terrified children watched from the back seat. A young woman harassed and detained for hours for filming officers during a confrontation. James knew their pain. He had lived it himself, and now he had the power to do something about it. He pulled out his phone, opening a secure messaging app. There were people he could trust, colleagues who shared his commitment to justice. He drafted a quick message to one of them, detailing the events of the night and attaching a backup copy of the recording from his device. If anything happened to him, the evidence wouldn't disappear. As he hit send, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, but he pushed it aside. There was still work to be done. The night wasn't over, and neither was his mission. James started the car again, the engine's low rumble breaking the stillness. He merged back onto the highway, his focus sharper than ever. He had endured the embers of his past and the flames of the present, and he knew the firestorm ahead would be even more intense. But he was ready. The town came into view as dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the small community in a muted, pale light. James Carter's SUV moved silently through the quiet streets, passing rows of aging houses, a few scattered businesses, and a church with peeling white paint. Despite the serene appearance, there was an undercurrent to the place that James could feel even through the safety of his car. It wasn't just quiet, it was subdued, like a town holding its breath. He parked outside the county courthouse, its brick facade imposing despite the chipped mortar and faded lettering above the double doors. This was the heart of the town's legal system, but James doubted much justice had passed through here. Not for people like him. Not for the ones who had to kneel under the weight of a system designed to crush them. James stepped out of the car, smoothing his suit and adjusting his tie. His movements were precise, deliberate. He didn't rush. He couldn't afford to show any sign of hesitation or weakness. Today, he wasn't just another man. He was the director of the FBI, and every step he took was a message. The courthouse lobby was nearly empty, its linoleum floors echoing with the sound of his polished shoes. A lone receptionist looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from polite indifference to mild confusion as James approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Yes," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with Sheriff Wallace. It's urgent." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness of the request. She glanced at his suit, her eyes lingering on the ID badge clipped to his lapel, and then reached for the phone on her desk. "Just a moment," she said, her voice a little more formal now. As she made the call, James let his eyes wander around the room. The walls were adorned with outdated community event posters and framed photographs of the town's leadership over the years. One of the photos caught his attention, a younger, slimmer Sheriff Wallace, standing proudly in front of the same courthouse, flanked by a group of uniformed officers. James recognized Rives in the photo, his smirk just as infuriating then as it had been last night. The receptionist hung up the phone and looked up at James. "The sheriff will see you in his office," she said. "Third floor, last door on the right." James nodded his thanks and made his way to the staircase. He climbed the steps steadily, each footfall deliberate, his thoughts racing as he prepared for the confrontation ahead. Sheriff Wallace was the gatekeeper of this town's law enforcement, the man who had allowed officers like Rives and Hendricks to thrive under his watch. Wallace might not have been directly involved in their actions, but his silence made him culpable. When James reached the third floor, he found the sheriff's office exactly as described. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could hear the low murmur of voices. He knocked once, firmly, before stepping inside. Sheriff Wallace looked up from behind his desk, his broad face creasing into a forced smile. He was a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and a demeanor that exuded authority. Sitting in a chair across from him was another man James recognized immediately, Officer John Hendricks. "Director Carter," Wallace said, rising to his feet and extending a hand. "This is an unexpected visit." James shook his hand briefly, his grip firm but not overly so. "Sheriff Wallace," he replied evenly, "I'm here on official business. We need to talk." Wallace gestured to the empty chair beside Hendricks. "Of course. Please have a seat." James didn't move immediately. His eyes flicked to Hendricks, who was avoiding his gaze, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The younger officer looked uncomfortable, his shoulders tense, his posture stiff. It was clear that Hendricks had been summoned here for a reason, and James suspected it wasn't to share coffee and pleasantries. After a brief pause, James took the offered seat, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. He leaned back slightly, exuding an air of calm confidence. "I won't waste your time, Sheriff," James began. "I have reason to believe that your department has been involved in multiple instances of misconduct, including racial profiling, harassment, and excessive use of force." Wallace's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Those are serious accusations, Director. I hope you have evidence to support them." James reached into his pocket and retrieved a small USB drive, placing it on the desk between them. "This contains audio and video evidence from a recent encounter between your officers and myself. It's only one example, but it's more than enough to warrant an investigation." Wallace's expression darkened. He didn't reach for the drive. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing over his chest. "Director Carter, you have to understand this is a small town. My officers do their best to maintain order, but it's not always easy. People don't always cooperate." James raised an eyebrow. "Is that how you justify Officer Rives shoving a gun into my mouth and forcing me to kneel on the side of the road?" Hendricks flinched at the words, his face flushing. Wallace's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. "That's not how we operate," Wallace said finally, his tone defensive. "If Ribs acted out of line, I'll handle it." "You'll handle it?" James repeated, his voice sharp. "This isn't an isolated incident, Sheriff. This is a pattern, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because you allowed it." Wallace's face turned a shade darker, his frustration evident. "You come into my town and accuse me of being complicit in misconduct? Do you have any idea how hard it is to run a department with limited resources, dealing with people who don't respect the law?" James leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "I know exactly how hard it is. I've spent my career working with law enforcement agencies across the country, but I also know that there's a difference between enforcing the law and abusing it." The tension in the room was palpable. Wallace's fists clenched on the desk, and for a moment it looked as though he might erupt, but then his gaze shifted to Hendricks, who was still staring at the floor. "Hendricks," Wallace said sharply, "you were there. What happened?" Hendricks hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at James, then back at Wallace. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. "Hendricks," Wallace repeated, his tone more forceful. "Answer me." The younger officer swallowed hard, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. "Rivs, he crossed a line." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Hendricks glanced at James again, his expression filled with guilt. He made Carter kneel, put a gun in his mouth. It wasn't right. Wallace's face went rigid, his jaw working as he processed the admission. He looked at James, then back at Hendricks. "And you let it happen?" Hendricks flinched. "I tried to stop him, but I didn't." "You didn't," James interrupted, his tone cold. "You let it happen. And now you'll face the consequences just like Rives." The room fell silent, the weight of Hendricks' confession hanging heavily in the air. Wallace looked like a man backed into a corner, his authority crumbling under the pressure of the truth. James stood, picking up the USB drive from the desk. "I'll be forwarding this evidence to the Department of Justice," he said, "and I'll be launching a formal investigation into your department, Sheriff. This is only the beginning." With that, James turned and walked out of the office, leaving Wallace and Hendricks to face the reality of what was to come. Justice was finally catching up with them, and James was determined to see it through. The courthouse steps echoed with James's steady footsteps as he emerged into the bright morning sunlight. The town's stillness felt heavier now, as if the air carried the weight of what had just transpired. People passed him on the street, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls he had just left behind. His mind churned with thoughts of what lay ahead. The USB drive in his pocket felt heavier than ever, a tangible representation of the truth he was about to unleash. He reached his SUV, slid into the driver's seat, and rested his hands on the steering wheel. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed a composed face, but he knew the real battle was only beginning. What he had witnessed in Wallace's office, a mix of denial, guilt, and desperation, was a microcosm of the larger fight. This wasn't just about Rives, Hendricks, or even Wallace. This was about a system that thrived on silence and complicity. James started the engine, the low rumble grounding him. He dialed a number on his phone's secure line and waited as it rang. The voice on the other end answered after the second ring. "Director Carter," came the familiar voice of his trusted aide, Lisa Hall. "I've been waiting for your call." "It's worse than I thought," James said, keeping his voice low. "I have evidence of direct misconduct. Rives went as far as to put a gun in my mouth. Hendricks admitted to witnessing it and doing nothing." Lisa let out a sharp breath. "You recorded it?" "I did. It's on a USB drive and backed up to the cloud," James replied. "But the problem isn't just the incident. It's systemic. Wallace has been shielding these men for years." "What's our next step?" Lisa asked, her tone all business. "I'm forwarding the evidence to the DOJ," James said. "But I need you to prepare a formal request for a federal investigation into the entire department. I want this airtight, Lisa. No loopholes, no technicalities." "Understood," Lisa said. "I'll start drafting it now." James ended the call, his resolve hardening. He pulled out onto the main road, heading toward the small motel where he had checked in the previous night. He needed a quiet place to organize his thoughts and finalize his next moves. The motel was as unassuming as he remembered. Faded paint, a flickering vacancy sign, and a lone clerk behind the desk. James nodded to the man as he passed through the lobby and headed to his room. Once inside, he locked the door and set his briefcase on the desk. He retrieved his laptop and connected the USB drive, the screen lighting up with folders labeled by date and time. He clicked on the most recent file. The video played back with crystal clarity, showing Reeves' smirk, Hendricks' hesitation, and the exact moment the gun was shoved into his mouth. James watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When the video ended, he sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was the kind of evidence that could spark outrage, the kind that could expose the depth of corruption in this town. But he also knew it wasn't enough. The system wouldn't go down without a fight. Wallace and his allies would use every resource at their disposal to discredit him, to paint him as a provocateur or an outsider meddling in their affairs. He needed more evidence, more witnesses, more leverage. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. The screen displayed a number he didn't recognize, but he answered it anyway. "Carter," he said. The voice on the other end was low and cautious. "Director Carter, my name is Maria Torres. I saw the news about you being in town. I think I can help." James frowned. "News? It's all over social media," Maria said. "People are saying the FBI director is here because of the police. I've been wanting to speak out for a long time, but I was scared. I didn't think anyone would listen." James leaned forward, his interest piqued. "I'm listening now, Maria. Tell me what you know." Maria hesitated, and James could hear the tremor in her voice. "2 years ago, my brother was stopped by Rives and Hendricks. They said he was speeding, but that wasn't true. They made him get out of the car, searched him, and when he asked why, Rives hit him, right there on the side of the road. My brother tried to file a complaint, but they threatened him. They said they'd arrest him for resisting arrest if he didn't drop it." James closed his eyes, the familiar wave of anger rising again. "Do you have proof?" "No," Maria admitted, "but there were witnesses, people who saw what happened but were too afraid to come forward. I can try to get them to talk." "Do it," James said. "And, Maria, thank you for calling. Your courage matters." After ending the call, James felt a flicker of hope. Maria's story wasn't unique, but it was a crack in the armor of silence that surrounded this town. If he could gather enough voices, enough evidence, he could dismantle the system that had protected Rives and others like him for so long. But as he sat back and began drafting his report for the DOJ, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lisa. "We have a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Wallace is already trying to spin this. He's claiming you provoked his officers and used your position to intimidate them. Local news is picking it up." James clenched his jaw. "Of course he is. Send a statement to the press, confirm that I was here as part of an ongoing investigation, and remind them that I have evidence." "That's not all," Lisa added. "Wallace has friends in high places. I'm hearing whispers that some of them are trying to pressure the DOJ to back off." James leaned forward, his free hand gripping the edge of the desk. "Let them try. We're not backing down." But he knew Lisa was right. The system wasn't just local. It extended far beyond this town. Wallace wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting an entire network of people who benefited from the status quo. James stared at the USB drive on the desk, its small, unassuming shape belying the power it held. This fight would be harder than he had anticipated, but he wasn't afraid. He had faced bigger challenges before, and he knew one thing for certain. The truth was on his side, and no matter how hard they tried to bury it, he would make sure it saw the light of day. James Carter stood in the center of the courtroom, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the polished wooden floors. Rows of seats were filled with local citizens, reporters, and a handful of activists who had come to witness what was shaping up to be a defining moment in the town's history. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed, flanked by the flags of the United States and the state. Across the aisle sat Sheriff Wallace and his legal team, their faces a mix of stoic determination and barely concealed hostility. To their left sat Rives, his expression unchanged, defiant, almost smug. Hendricks was noticeably absent, having agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a calculated risk on James's part, but he knew the younger officer's testimony would be pivotal. James glanced at his own legal team, nodding to Lisa, who had flown in to support him. She returned the nod, her face set with steely resolve. They had spent the last week building their case, gathering every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every ounce of truth they could find. Today was the day it would all come to light. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The room fell silent as she took her seat, her gavel striking once to call the court to order. "This hearing is now in session," she announced. "The case before us involves allegations of misconduct, abuse of power, and corruption within the local police department. We will hear testimony and review evidence to determine the appropriate course of action." James felt a surge of anticipation as the prosecution rose to begin their opening statement. The attorney, a seasoned litigator named Eric Donovan, laid out the case with precision and clarity, painting a picture of systemic abuse that extended far beyond Rives and Hendricks. He detailed the evidence they would present, video recordings, witness testimonies, and a pattern of behavior that could not be ignored. When it was James's turn to testify, he approached the witness stand with a calm confidence. He swore the oath, his voice steady, and took his seat. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Donovan began his questioning. "Director Carter," Donovan said, "can you describe the events that occurred on the night of your encounter with Officers Rives and Hendricks?" James recounted the story in vivid detail, sparing nothing. He described the stop, the search, and the escalating aggression. When he spoke about Rives forcing the gun into his mouth, the room seemed to collectively flinch. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every silent judgment. But he didn't falter. "Do you have evidence of this encounter?" Donovan asked. "I do," James replied. "It's been submitted to the court." The prosecutor nodded and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to play the recording for the court." The judge gave a curt nod and the video began to play. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Rives's mocking voice, the cold commands, the humiliation. The moment the gun was shoved into James's mouth played in stark clarity, eliciting audible gasps from the spectators. When the video ended, the judge's expression was unreadable, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Rives no longer looked smug. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted toward his attorney, who leaned in to whisper urgently. Donovan continued, "Director Carter, why did you choose to endure this treatment rather than reveal your identity at the time?" James met the prosecutor's gaze, then turned to the judge and jury. "Because I needed to see how far they would go. I needed to gather undeniable evidence of what happens to people in this town when they encounter law enforcement. If I had revealed who I was, they would have stopped. But their actions that night proved exactly what I came here to expose. This isn't about one bad officer. This is about a culture of abuse." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Donovan thanked him and sat down, but James remained on the stand as Rives's attorney rose for cross-examination. "Director Carter," the man began, his tone sharp, "isn't it true that you came to this town with the intention of provoking a confrontation?" James didn't blink. "No, I came to observe." "Isn't it also true," the attorney pressed, "that by withholding your identity, you created a situation that escalated unnecessarily?" "The situation escalated because Officer Rives chose to escalate it," James replied evenly. My identity shouldn't matter. What matters is how he treated me when he thought I was just another citizen." The attorney frowned, but he didn't press further. The truth was too clear, the evidence too damning. Next came Hendrix's testimony. The younger officer was visibly nervous as he took the stand, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. But when he began to speak, his voice was steady. "Rice went too far," Hendrix admitted. "He's gone too far before. I should have stopped him. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't. I was scared of him." "Scared of him?" Donovan asked. "Why?" Hendrix hesitated, then said, "Because he has friends in high places, people who protect him. I thought if I went against him, it would ruin me." James watched as the courtroom absorbed Hendrix's words. They painted a picture of a department not just corrupted by one man, but by an entire network of influence and fear. The hearing continued for hours, each piece of evidence building the case against Rives and the department. Witnesses like Maria Torres stepped forward, their voices shaking but determined. They shared stories of brutality and harassment, of a system that had failed them again and again. When the final arguments were made, James felt a sense of closure. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the judge to decide. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered her ruling. She declared that Rives would face criminal charges, that Hendrix's cooperation would be considered in his sentencing, and that a federal investigation into the entire department would begin immediately. Wallace's role would also be scrutinized, and reforms would be mandated. As the gavel struck, James felt a wave of relief. It wasn't a complete victory. There was still much work to be done, but it was a start. The truth had prevailed, and the system had been forced to face itself. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, their questions coming rapid fire. James held up a hand to silence them. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "This is about justice. It's about holding people accountable, no matter their position, and it's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what so many in this town have suffered. The work isn't over. It's just beginning." With that, he walked away, his steps steady, his resolve unshaken. Justice had taken its first steps, and James knew he would keep fighting until it reached every corner of the system. Thank you for watching to the end. If you are interested in such stories, subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends. Let's discuss important topics together. See you in the next video.